Hey there and welcome. Most of us spend our lives working for a wage, right? But have you ever really stopped and thought about how we got here? How did the 9 to 5, the job market, this whole idea of selling your time just to live, how did that become normal? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden history of our working lives. It's a story told through three very different kinds of person. So let's dive in.
So let's start with what seems like a really simple question. What is a person? Now, you're probably thinking, well, I'm a person, a human being, and you're not wrong, but legally and economically, the answer is way more complicated and has a lot more to do with law than biology. For centuries, the definition of a person has been this incredibly powerful tool for shaping our whole society.
The word itself actually gives us a huge hint about what's going on. It comes from the Latin word persona, which literally meant the mask an actor wore on stage. It wasn't the actor, but the role they were playing, the king, the villain, the hero. And that idea is absolutely central to what we're talking about today. Personhood isn't just about who you are, it's about the role you've been assigned in this big economic drama.
And that brings us right to Act 1, the creation of our first character, the real person. Now, we're not talking about the origins of humanity here. We're talking about a very specific historical process that took millions of people from being pretty self-sufficient to becoming the modern wage laborer we all recognize today. Yeah, this change didn't just happen naturally, it was a deliberate legal project that took centuries. It really kicked off in the 1600s with these things called the Enclosure Acts, which basically privatized land that communities had used for generations to survive. This sped up, and by the 1800s, with laws like the Poor Law Amendment Act, the deal was sealed. A new reality was set in stone. If you don't own property, your only option is to work for someone who does. This chart does a fantastic job of showing exactly what was lost. On the left, you see the old world of shared rights. You could graze your cow, gather firewood, grow food for your family. It was all about community survival. But then look at the right, the new world of private property. All of a sudden, it's no trespassing. Those resources now belong to one owner, and the goal is no longer feeding the community, it's generating profit for that owner. An entire way of life was just erased, and it created a whole new class of people with nothing left to sell but their labor. So you have millions of people with no land and no way to feed themselves. What happens to them? Well, the state had a solution, and it was a brutal one: the workhouse. And let's be clear, these were not charities. As the historian E.P. Thompson said, they were designed to be so miserable, so awful, that any factory job, no matter how dangerous or poorly paid, looked like a better option. The choice wasn't really between work and leisure. It was between wage labor and a state-run nightmare.
And this gets us to a really crucial point, captured perfectly here. Workers were now free, but it's this incredibly cruel paradox. Sure, they were free to sell their labor to any boss they wanted, but they were also freed from the land, the tools, all the things that would have let them survive on their own. This wasn't real liberty. This was dependency being sold as freedom.
Now, if you build a system based on force, you're going to need a really good story to make it seem okay. And that brings us to Act 2, and our second character, the moral person. This is the ideological mask, the PR campaign designed to make this forced dependency seem like a virtue.
The philosophical foundation for this story came from thinkers like John Locke. His idea was simple, and honestly, it sounds really appealing. He said that when you work on something from nature, when you mix your labor with it, you earn the right to own it. It's a powerful idea that directly connects your personal effort to private property, giving it a moral justification.
And here it is in Locke's own words. It sounds incredibly fair, right? I mean, it suggests a world where hard work is always rewarded and being wealthy is just a sign of your merit. This idea became the moral backbone of the whole system, painting the rich as deserving and the poor as, well, just not working hard enough. It conveniently ignores that whole dispossession thing we just talked about.
But let's pause here and ask a really important question. Does a corporation, this abstract legal entity, actually mix its labor with anything? It doesn't have hands. It doesn't have a body. It just hires actual people who do have hands and bodies to do the labor. And when you ask that simple question, the entire moral argument starts to fall apart. And that leads us straight into our final act, and our most powerful character by far, the corporate person. This is the big plot twist of our story, an entirely artificial being, a legal fiction that somehow ends up with more power and more protections than the real living people we met back in Act 1. So how is this even possible? Through an old legal concept called persona ficta, which is just Latin for a fictional person.
It actually started in medieval times to allow institutions, like the church, to legally act like a single person, to own property, sue, and be sued. It's a mask of personhood, but a mask that carries immense legal weight.
And over the last 200 years, the courts have basically given this legal fiction superpowers. As you can see on this timeline, one court decision after another transformed the corporation. It's wild. In 1886, a court note suggests corporations deserve 14th Amendment rights, which, were originally intended for freed slaves. By 2010, with Citizens United, the Supreme Court decided that a corporation spending money on politics counts as free speech.
So, at the end of the day, who ends up being more of a person under the law? This comparison is pretty shocking. A real human can go to jail for doing something wrong. A corporation can't. A human dies. A corporation can, in theory, live forever. But here's the biggest one. A human is fully responsible for their debts and actions. A corporation gives its owners limited liability, a powerful legal shield. The artificial person is often way more protected than the real one. This situation has led to some pretty powerful critiques. Legal scholar Joel Bakan argues that by its very design, the modern corporation acts like a psychopath. Its only legal mandate is to pursue its own self-interest, that is, profit, above absolutely everything else, no matter the cost to people or the planet. It's literally a person without a conscience. All right, it's time for the climax. Let's bring all three of our characters, our three masks, back on stage together. Because when you see them side by side, the true purpose of the whole system becomes crystal clear. It exposes what our source material calls a great inversion, almost like a form of legal fraud.
This right here is the architecture of the whole system. First, you have the real person, the actual worker who's forced into the system and has to bear all the risk. In the middle, you have the moral person. That's the myth, the story of the self-made man, which is used to justify the whole thing and blame the victim. And finally, you have the corporate person, the legal fiction perfectly designed to collect all the benefits while being shielded from almost all responsibility.
Let's put it even more simply. The real person is burdened with responsibility. The moral person is the myth created to justify that burden. And the corporate person is the legal lie engineered to escape that responsibility. Burden, justification, and escape. That's the whole play.
And that brings us right back to where we began, and to one final question for you. We started with the idea of persona, a mask worn by an actor on a stage. After seeing this whole story play out, you have to ask, when a legal fiction, a fake person, has more rights and protections than a real, living, breathing human being, who is that mask really for?